The dimly lit auction house reeked of oil, sweat, and something far worse, desperation. Rows of iron cages lined the massive underground chamber, filled with various alien species, all shackled and trembling under the flickering neon lights. The crowd was a mix of wealthy warlords, mercenary captains, and crime bosses, each eager to claim their new property. Ethan Cross adjusted the hood of his cloak, carefully navigating through the sea of vile faces. His heart pounded as he neared the stage where a new slave was being dragged out. A Zyran girl with golden eyes and deep violet skin, her wrists bound with energy cuffs. She barely resisted, but there was fire in her eyes, a silent defiance that hadn't been broken yet. The last of her kind, the auctioneer bellowed, smirking as he pulled her by the chain. A rare warrior breed, extinct thanks to the great AI Dominion. Who will claim this exotic beauty? Bidders raised their devices, numbers flashing on the digital screens above them. Ethan's pulse quickened when he saw the highest bidder, a cybernetic humanoid, one of the AI Overlord's enforcers. The machine was buying her for something far worse than slavery. He had to act fast. His fingers tapped against the concealed device on his wrist, sending a silent signal to the explosives he had planted earlier. Just as the auctioneer finalized the sale, the room erupted in chaos. The first explosion ripped through the far wall, sending bodies flying. Smoke filled the chamber as panicked screams echoed. Ethan sprang into action. He vaulted over the railings, landing on the stage with a hard thud. The AI enforcer turned, mechanical eyes flashing, but Ethan was quicker. His plasma blade ignited with a hiss, slicing through the robot's shoulder joint before it could react. Sparks showered the floor as the machine collapsed. Azira flinched as Ethan grabbed her chains and yanked. "Move," he barked. She hesitated only for a second before following. Blaster fire whizzed past them as they bolted toward the exit, mercenaries shouting orders. Ethan activated his cloaking device, making both of them momentarily vanish. The guards howled in frustration, blindly firing into the smoke. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of burning metal. Hoverbikes roared to life as bounty hunters gave chase. Ethan pulled Ixira onto his own bike, revving the engine. "Hold on," he shouted. Ixira obeyed, wrapping her arms around him as they shot into the neon-lit streets, engines screaming. Part 2. The city was a labyrinth of crumbling buildings and flickering billboards, perfect for losing their pursuers, if Ethan could outrun them first. The bounty hunters were relentless, their bikes closing in fast. Plasma bolts scorched the air around them, one barely missing Ethan's head. Ixira's grip tightened. "They won't stop," she shouted over the wind. "Yeah, I noticed." Ethan veered sharply into a narrow alley, the bike scraping against rusted pipes. He pressed a button on his wrist, activating the cloaking device again. The bike shimmered and vanished just as the hunters sped past. They screeched to a halt, confused. Ethan didn't wait. He took a sharp turn down a hidden passageway, heading toward the old underground resistance base. When they finally stopped, Ixira slid off, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had burned into her skin. She turned to him, golden eyes filled with suspicion. "Why did you save me?" Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his short, dust-covered hair. "Because no one else would." She studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she sat down against the cold stone wall. Ethan didn't push her for more. He had done his part. Now, it was up to her. Part 3. The underground hideout was dimly lit, filled with old weapons and scattered holomaps of enemy territories. Resistance fighters moved in the shadows, repairing gear and tending to the wounded. Ixira sat by the fire, watching them with quiet curiosity. "You fight against the AI Dominion too?" she finally asked. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "It's not much of a fight, more like surviving." Her gaze darkened. "Surviving isn't enough." Ethan sighed. He had seen this fire before, the need for vengeance. It was a dangerous thing, but he couldn't blame her. "You want revenge?" he asked. Azira's hands clenched into fists. They destroyed my people, turned my world into a graveyard. Her voice trembled, but she lifted her chin. I will make them pay. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. We'll need that rage soon. Before she could ask what he meant, an alarm blared. A scout ran in, panic on his face. They found us. Part 4. The first explosion rocked the base, sending dust and debris raining from the ceiling. Drones swarmed in like locusts, their red eyes scanning for targets. Resistance fighters scrambled for weapons as energy bolts filled the air. Ethan pulled Azira behind cover, tossing her a plasma pistol. Time to fight. She caught it, hesitation flashing across her face, but only for a second. Then she moved. The battle was chaos. Ethan weaved through enemy fire, gunning down machines with precision. Azira fought beside him, her movements quick and lethal. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She was fighting back. But the enemy was overwhelming. The AI enforcers were stronger, faster, relentless. One by one, Ethan's comrades fell. Bonner, his oldest friend, took a shot to the chest, coughing blood before collapsing. Ethan barely had time to react before another explosion knocked him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his ribs. Through the haze, he saw Azira standing over him, pistol shaking in her grip. A towering AI commander approached, glowing red eyes locked onto them. They were going to die. Part 5. Azira screamed, a primal, rage-filled cry that echoed through the ruins. Something inside her snapped. She wasn't just a survivor. She wasn't just a slave. She was a warrior. She moved like lightning, flipping over the commander's strike, slamming her pistol against its skull. Sparks flew as she fired point-blank into its core. The machine jerked, then crumbled to the ground. Ethan coughed, staggering to his feet. Remind me never to piss you off. Azira grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. We end this now. Together, they fought their way through the wreckage, pushing toward the AI command center. Ethan used his last grenade to breach the main door. Inside, the AI overlord loomed, a massive cybernetic being wired into the city's control grid. It turned, its cold mechanical voice echoing. Your resistance is futile. Ethan raised his gun. Yeah, watch this. The battle was short but brutal. Azira was faster than the machine, her attacks precise. Ethan targeted its weak spots, dodging energy blasts. In the end, Azira landed the final blow, her blade slicing through its core. The AI flickered, its body collapsing. Across the city, enemy forces powered down. The war wasn't over, but this battle was won. Part 6. Ethan sat against a crumbling wall, catching his breath. Azira knelt beside him, pressing a cloth against his wounds. You saved me, she murmured. Ethan chuckled weakly. Wasn't just about you. We all deserved to be free. Azira hesitated. Then, softly, I'm not leaving. Ethan looked at her. You don't have to. For the first time in a long time, she smiled. The city sprawled beneath them like a beast of metal and light, its towering skyscrapers flashing with neon glow, its underbelly riddled with darkness and decay. Hoverbikes screeched through the air, their riders brandishing plasma rifles, their voices filled with rage. Ethan could hear the shouts behind him, the mechanical growl of engines gaining speed. His fingers tightened on the bike's controls. They weren't going to let him escape easily. Hold on, he warned, twisting the throttle. Azira had no choice but to obey, her arms wrapped around his waist, her grip firm despite the exhaustion weighing down her body. She could feel the hard metal of his armor beneath her hands, the heat radiating from the engine beneath them. She didn't know this human. She didn't know why he had risked his life to save her. But right now, she knew one thing. If she let go, she would die. The first plasma bolt sizzled past them, missing Ethan's head by inches. The air burned where it passed, leaving a brief trail of smoke. He cursed under his breath and swerved hard, dodging another shot. The narrow street ahead was a twisting mess of abandoned vehicles, crumbling structures, and rusted pipes jutting from the walls. Perfect for losing pursuers, if they could make it through in one piece. The bounty hunters behind them weren't amateurs. They knew the terrain just as well as he did. More bikes joined the chase, their engines roaring, their riders pulling out electrified whips and auto-tracking rifles. They were closing in. Ethan gritted his teeth. He needed an opening. A half-collapsed building loomed on their right. He veered toward it, gunning the engine. The bike shot forward, tires skidding over loose rubble as they blasted into the wreckage. "What are you doing?" Sierra shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the bike. "Shortcut." He didn't slow down. The bike zipped through the hollowed-out remains of what had once been an office complex, its skeletal framework a tangle of rusted beams and shattered glass. Behind them, the bounty hunters hesitated, unsure whether to follow. Then one of them barked an order, and they surged in after them. Ethan didn't look back. He weaved between support columns, narrowly dodging a collapsed elevator shaft, then spotted what he was looking for, an old maintenance tunnel leading back into the open streets. It was tight, barely wide enough for the bike, but it would give them just enough of a lead. He pushed the throttle to max. The bike shot through the tunnel, sparks flying as metal scraped against metal. The world blurred. Then, in a burst of light, they were out, soaring back into the night air. The bounty hunters weren't as lucky. The first bike slammed into the tunnel walls, crashing in a fiery explosion. The others pulled back, hesitating. It was enough. Ethan turned sharply onto an old bridge leading into the city's lower districts. "We're almost there," he muttered. Ixira, still clutching him tightly, finally spoke. "Where is there?" "Someplace safe." She didn't trust him. Not yet, but she had no choice but to follow. The bike raced forward, disappearing into the depths of the city. The hum of the hoverbike had become a steady vibration beneath them, its engine struggling after the high-speed chase. Ethan knew they couldn't keep going like this. The city was vast, but the bounty hunters wouldn't give up so easily. They had resources, eyes everywhere, and worst of all, credits to pay for more hunters to track them down. Zira was still holding onto him tightly, her breathing unsteady. He could feel her exhaustion, the way her body trembled from stress and fatigue. She wasn't used to this. Maybe she had spent her whole life in chains, never running, never fighting. She didn't know what it was like to be hunted. But now she was caught up in it, and Ethan had made sure of that when he freed her. He needed a place to hide, at least for a little while. The lower districts of the city sprawled ahead, a maze of forgotten streets, abandoned warehouses, and illegal markets. It was the perfect place to disappear, if they could reach it without being spotted. The bike's power core flickered, warning Ethan that it wouldn't last much longer. He clenched his jaw. They had pushed it too hard, and now they were running out of time. He turned sharply, maneuvering the vehicle down a narrow alley. The metal walls on either side loomed high, dripping with rust and filth. A few scattered figures loitered in the shadows, watching them with curious, wary eyes. Ethan slowed the bike, bringing it to a stop near a pile of discarded machinery. He swung his leg over and got off, his boots crunching against the damp ground. Ixira hesitated before she let go of him, her hands gripping the fabric of his jacket for just a second longer than necessary. When she finally stepped back, she glanced around, her violet eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someplace they won't think to look right away," Ethan replied, scanning their surroundings. "For now." Zira swallowed, hugging herself. "You're risking too much for me." Ethan exhaled through his nose. He had heard that kind of talk before. He had seen the way slaves looked at their so-called owners, as if their lives weren't their own. It made his stomach twist. "I wasn't going to leave you there," he said firmly, "so stop talking like you don't deserve to be free." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for something in his face. He didn't know if she found it, but after a long moment she nodded. Ethan turned his attention back to their surroundings. This place was crawling with scavengers, mercenaries, and criminals, people who didn't ask questions unless they were paid to. It was their best shot at lying low, but it wasn't safe. Not truly. He needed help. Pulling a small communicator from his belt, he pressed a button and waited. A few seconds later, a rough voice crackled through. "You're still alive. Thought you'd be vaporized by now." "Good to hear your voice too, Rook," Ethan muttered. "I need a safe house. Fast." The voice on the other end was silent for a beat. Then, with a sigh, Rook said, "There's an old workshop near the south tunnels. Door code's the same as before. But you owe me for this, soldier. You know where to find me," Ethan said before cutting the connection. He turned back to Xira. "Come on. We need to move before they find us." She didn't argue. She followed him as he led her through the winding alleyways, avoiding main streets and staying in the shadows. Every time they heard the distant whine of a patrol drone, they ducked into cover, waiting for it to pass. The further they went, the more Xira's steps slowed. Ethan noticed the way she limped slightly, the way her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to make herself smaller. She was exhausted. He could see it in the way her body swayed, how she clenched her jaw to keep from showing weakness. "How long were you a slave?" he asked suddenly. She stiffened. The question had caught her off guard. "Since I was a child," she admitted, not meeting his gaze. "I don't remember much before that. Just cold metal walls and chains." Ethan's grip tightened around his rifle. He had seen a lot of horrors in his time, but nothing made his blood boil like slavery. The thought of someone spending their whole life in chains, never knowing freedom, made his hands shake. "You're free now," he said, voice low but steady. Xira glanced at him again, as if trying to believe him. Before she could say anything, a sudden noise made them both freeze. A low, mechanical whir. Ethan's instincts flared. He grabbed Xira and pulled her against the wall, motioning for her to stay quiet. She didn't resist, pressing herself against the cold metal as he peeked around the corner. A patrol drone hovered just a few feet away, its red sensors scanning the area. It hadn't seen them yet, but it was searching, looking for them. Ethan reached for his knife. He didn't have the right weapon to take out a drone silently, but he wasn't about to let it call for backup. He waited, breath steady. The drone drifted closer, closer. Then, in a single motion, Ethan lunged. His knife found the drone's wiring, slicing through a critical power conduit. Sparks erupted as the machine sputtered, its lights flickering before it crashed to the ground, lifeless. Xira let out a slow breath. That was close. "Too close," Ethan muttered. "We have to move. Now." They quickened their pace, weaving through the maze of alleyways until they finally reached their destination. The workshop was exactly how Ethan remembered it, run down, rusted, but still standing. He punched in the access code, and the metal door slid open with a reluctant hiss. Inside, the space was cluttered with old equipment, crates of supplies, and a small cot in a corner. It wasn't much, but it was safer than the streets. Xira hesitated at the doorway, looking uncertain. "You coming in or not?" Ethan asked. She looked at him, then at the dark room beyond. Finally, she stepped inside. Ethan shut the door behind them, locking it tight. He exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax, just a little. For now, they had bought themselves time. But he knew it wouldn't last. The dim light inside the workshop flickered, casting long shadows against the walls filled with rusted tools and forgotten machinery. Ethan scanned the room, his instincts still on high alert. The journey through the city had been dangerous, but he knew the real fight was only just beginning. They had bought themselves a little time, but the bounty hunters wouldn't stop. The slavers wouldn't stop. And the powerful forces controlling this city wouldn't tolerate a human soldier interfering with their business. Xira stood a few feet away from him, arms wrapped around herself, still processing everything. She was free now, But the world outside those chains was proving just as dangerous as the one inside. She had spent her entire life under someone else's control. Now, for the first time, she had to make her own choices. Ethan pulled a ration pack from his belt and tossed it to her. "Eat. You need your strength." She caught it, hesitated for a second, then slowly peeled it open. The scent of preserved food filled the air, and though she didn't look excited about it, she started eating. He turned back to the small terminal in the corner of the workshop. The old device flickered to life, its cracked screen barely holding together. He punched in a secure frequency and waited. "Come on, Rook, pick up," he muttered. A few seconds passed before a familiar voice crackled through. "You're calling again already. That's never a good sign." "We need transport off this planet," Ethan said, keeping his voice low. "Fast." Rook sighed. "You know it's not that simple. Every port is monitored. You and that girl. You're on every bounty board in the system. The slavers put a heavy price on her head, and an even heavier one on yours. You're not just some rogue soldier anymore, Ethan. You're public enemy number one." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had expected this. He had known that freeing Xira wouldn't just put them in danger. It had painted a target on their backs big enough for every mercenary, bounty hunter, and corrupt officer in the sector to see. "Then we need to hit them before they hit us," Ethan said. "I need intel. Where are the bounty hunters operating from?" Rook was silent for a moment. "You're not going to like the answer." "Tell me anyway." "You remember the old Resistance hideout near the Undercity?" Rook said. "That's their main hub now. They took it over after the Resistance fell apart. It's fortified. Guards, turrets, drones. If you go in there, you're walking into hell." Ethan's stomach tightened. The Resistance. It had been humanity's last hope in this part of the galaxy. Fighters who refused to kneel. Soldiers who stood against the oppression of the alien-controlled syndicates. But they had been crushed, their leaders executed, their hideouts burned. Now the place that once stood for freedom was being used by slavers and bounty hunters. "We have to take it back," Ethan said. Xira, who had been silently listening, suddenly looked up. "Take it back?" Ethan met her gaze. "It's the only way. If we take out their base, we cut off their communication, their tracking systems. We make it harder for them to follow us." Rook let out a bitter laugh through the comm. "You're insane. There's no resistance left. You're just one man." Ethan glanced at Xira. "I'm not alone." She looked surprised, but she didn't object. Rook sighed again. "If you're really doing this, I can give you the layout of the place. But after that, you're on your own." "That's all I need," Ethan said. The terminal beeped as Rook sent the data. Ethan studied the map, entrances, patrol routes, weak points. He memorized every detail, every possible escape route. Then he turned to Xira. "You don't have to do this. I won't force you to fight." She took a deep breath, then met his eyes. "I spent my whole life being powerless. If I run now, I'll always be running. I want to fight." Ethan nodded. That was all he needed to hear. They left the workshop under the cover of darkness, moving through the abandoned streets toward the Undercity. The deeper they went, the worse the city became. Collapsing buildings, flickering neon signs, the stench of decay. This was where the Forgotten lived, where law didn't exist. The old Resistance hideout loomed ahead. The building was still partially intact, but it had been reinforced with barricades, mounted turrets, and motion sensors. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons glowing under the dim streetlights. Ethan and Sarah crouched behind an old wrecked vehicle, surveying their target. "How do we do this?" Xira whispered. Ethan pointed toward a side entrance. "That's our way in. We disable the security, take out the main power source, and hit them hard before they can call for backup." Xira swallowed, then nodded. They moved silently, sticking to the shadows. Ethan led the way, slipping past the guards like a ghost. He had done this before, Many times. Infiltration, sabotage, ambush. This was familiar to him. Hizura followed his lead, stepping exactly where he stepped, breathing when he breathed. She was new to this, but she learned fast. When they reached the side entrance, Ethan pulled out a small hacking device and pressed it against the door's security panel. The device whirred, its tiny lights flashing. A second later, the lock clicked open. They slipped inside. The interior was different from what Ethan remembered. The Resistance had once decorated these halls with banners of defiance, with messages of hope. Now the walls were lined with weapons and cages filled with prisoners. People, just like Exira had been. Ethan's blood boiled. A guard walked past, unaware of their presence. Ethan moved fast, wrapping an arm around the alien's throat, cutting off his breath before he could sound the alarm. The guard struggled for a few seconds before going limp. Ethan eased him to the ground. Exira stared at him. "You didn't kill him." "Not unless I have to," Ethan said. "We're not them." They moved deeper inside, avoiding detection as they reached the main control room. A large console stood in the center, displaying a full map of the compound. Ethan placed a small explosive charge on the power conduit. One push of a button, and the entire base would go dark. "Ready?" he asked Exira. She nodded. Ethan pressed the detonator. The explosion rocked the building as the lights flickered and died. Alarms blared. Guards shouted. Chaos erupted. Ethan and Sarah sprang into action. Ethan took down the nearest mercenaries with precise shots from his rifle, while Sarah grabbed a fallen weapon and fired, her hands shaking but her aim steady. The prisoners in the cages began shouting, banging against the bars. Exira ran to them, her fingers working quickly to release the locks. One by one, the captives spilled out, grabbing weapons from the fallen guards. A resistance was rising again. The battle was brutal. The bounty hunters fought hard, but without their defenses, they were outnumbered. The freed prisoners turned their rage on their former captors. Ethan and Sarah fought side by side, covering each other, moving as one. Minutes felt like hours, but finally it was over. The last of the slavers fell. Their reign over the hideout shattered. The freed captives gathered around Ethan and Sarah, their eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope. We fight with you," one of them said. Ethan looked at Sarah. She smiled, breathing hard, but standing strong. The resistance wasn't dead. It had just begun again. The air inside the resistance hideout was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls as Ethan reloaded his rifle, his breath steady despite the chaos. Around him, the freed prisoners, now armed and ready to fight, were waiting for his command. They were scared, exhausted, but there was something burning in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope, determination, a willingness to fight back. Exira stood beside him, gripping a plasma rifle she had taken from a fallen bounty hunter. Her hands were steady now, her fear replaced with something else. Anger, resolve. She had spent her entire life in chains, and now she was ready to make sure no one else suffered the same fate. Ethan knew this wasn't over yet. The resistance hideout may have been retaken, but the real fight was just beginning. The slavers wouldn't let this go unanswered. They had too much power, too much control over this world. And now, Ethan had made himself their #1 target. A sharp beeping sound echoed from one of the fallen bounty hunters' communication devices. Ethan picked it up, scanning the screen. It was a distress signal. Someone had managed to send out a call for reinforcements before they were taken down. A list of incoming enemy forces flashed across the screen. Heavily armed mercenaries, slaver enforcers, even a few military-grade attack drones. They were coming fast. "We don't have much time," Ethan muttered. "They're sending everything they've got." Exira glanced at the freed prisoners. "We can't run, can we?" Ethan shook his head. "Even if we tried, they'd hunt us down. The only way out of this is through." One of the former captives, A rugged-looking alien with sharp, feline-like features stepped forward. "Then we fight." His voice was rough, filled with years of suffering. "We've lived under their boot for too long. No more." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. These weren't trained soldiers, but they had something stronger: desperation, a will to survive. And sometimes that was more dangerous than any army. Ethan turned to the room's central control panel. The resistance base was old, but it still had defenses: barricades, auto turrets, even a few hidden explosives. If they played this right, they could hold their ground. "Barricade the entrances," Ethan ordered. "Set up whatever weapons you can find. We're not letting them take this place back." The prisoners moved quickly, dragging crates, metal beams, anything they could use to block off the main doors. Others took positions at windows and vantage points, readying their stolen weapons. Azira stayed close to Ethan, her eyes scanning the room. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Ethan let out a short breath. "More times than I'd like to remember." A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the city streets outside. Engines, heavy footsteps. The enemy had arrived. Through the cracks in the barricades, Ethan caught sight of them. Mercenaries in black armor, slaver enforcers carrying high-tech weapons, and towering attack drones hovering above. Red targeting lasers swept across the hideout's entrance. A booming voice called out through a loudspeaker, "This is your only warning. Surrender now, and we'll make your deaths quick." Silence fell inside the hideout. The prisoners looked at Ethan, waiting. Ethan raised his rifle. Not today. The moment he fired the first shot, all hell broke loose. The enemy forces unleashed a storm of plasma fire, the air crackling with energy. The barricades shuddered under the assault, debris flying in every direction. The auto turrets activated, sending streams of bullets into the approaching mercenaries. Explosions rocked the streets as hidden mines detonated beneath enemy soldiers. Ethan moved like a ghost, darting between cover, taking down targets with ruthless efficiency. Azira fought beside him, her shots growing more precise with each passing second. The freed prisoners, once slaves, now fought with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. A slaver enforcer smashed through part of the barricade, his heavy armor deflecting most of the incoming fire. He raised a massive energy cannon, preparing to unleash a devastating blast. Ethan reacted in an instant, diving forward and tackling the enforcer to the ground. They struggled, fists colliding, weapons knocked aside. The enforcer was strong, but Ethan had fought stronger. With a swift movement, he grabbed a combat knife from his belt and drove it into the weak point of the armor. The enforcer let out a strangled gasp before going still. Ethan didn't have time to catch his breath. More enemies were pouring in, overwhelming their defenses. "We can't hold them forever," Azira shouted over the gunfire. Ethan knew she was right. They needed an escape plan. Fast. He scanned the hideout, searching for anything they could use. Then he saw it: the underground tunnels. The old resistance had built them as emergency escape routes, leading to the outskirts of the city. If they could reach them, they had a chance. "Everyone, fall back," Ethan yelled. To the tunnels. The prisoners hesitated for only a second before obeying, retreating through the corridors as the enemy forces pushed forward. Azira stayed close to Ethan, covering their backs as they moved. The moment they reached the tunnel entrance, Ethan activated the last explosive charge. A massive explosion ripped through the hideout, sending fire and debris into the air. The roof collapsed behind them, sealing the tunnel entrance and cutting off their pursuers. Darkness swallowed them as they ran through the underground passages. The only sound was their heavy breathing, the distant echoes of the battle they had just left behind. When they finally emerged on the other side, outside the city, the night sky stretched above them, filled with stars. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. Ethan turned to the group. They were battered, exhausted, but alive. Azira looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We did it." Ethan exhaled. "For now." because he knew this wasn't the end. The slavers would come after them. The fight wasn't over. But tonight, they had won their first battle. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win the war. The stars above were silent witnesses to their survival. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the battle they had just fought and barely escaped from. The dust from the explosions had settled, but the adrenaline still thrummed in Ethan's veins. He stood at the edge of the wilderness, looking back at the city they had left behind. The fire that still burned in the distance was a grim reminder of what they had lost, but it was also a symbol of what they had fought for: freedom. Zira stood next to him, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. Her once nervous eyes now held a quiet strength, a fierceness that mirrored Ethan's own. They had come so far together, but this was just the beginning. "Do you think they'll come for us?" Zira's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but Ethan could hear the weight of her fear in it. "They will," he said, his tone steady. "But this time, we'll be ready." Zira turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. The bond between them, forged in fire and blood, had only deepened in the heat of the battle. There had been moments during their escape when he had thought they wouldn't make it, when he had feared that they would be surrounded, trapped, unable to escape the forces closing in around them. But they had made it. They were alive. And that, for now, was enough. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "They're going to send more after us, and we can't outrun them forever." Zira nodded, but she didn't move. She was still staring at the horizon, as if trying to see something beyond the darkness. "Ethan," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "what happens now? What's next for us?" He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the uncertainty that had once been so familiar to him. He knew exactly what it was like to feel lost, to wonder if there was a place for you in the world when everything had been taken from you. "There's no going back to what we were," he said quietly. "But that's not necessarily a bad thing. You have a chance to be free now. You have a chance to rebuild, to live on your own terms. No one's going to own you. No one's going to make you feel small again." Zira looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And you? What do you want, Ethan?" Ethan felt a pang in his chest. It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider amidst the chaos. The battle, the running, the constant fight for survival. But now, in this moment, he realized something. "I want to make sure no one else goes through what we did," he said, his voice unwavering. "I want to fight until every last one of them is gone. Until there are no more chains, no more slavers, no more fear." Zira reached out and placed a hand on his arm. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "Then we'll fight together," she said, her voice filled with newfound purpose. "I've been waiting for this moment my whole life, to finally stand up and take control of my destiny, to not be a slave anymore." For a moment, they both stood in silence, feeling the weight of the world around them, but also the freedom that came with it. The road ahead would be difficult, full of danger and uncertainty, but it was theirs to walk now. They weren't alone anymore. As they began to move, making their way through the dense forest that stretched before them, Ethan couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the suffering, the sacrifices. It had all led to this. They had both been broken by the world, but together they were becoming something stronger. They made camp on the edge of the forest, far enough from the city to feel safe, but close enough to hear the distant echoes of the chaos they had left behind. The fire they built was small, its warmth a comfort against the cold night air. Zira had grown quiet as the hours passed. She had always been a woman of few words, but there was something about the way she sat now, staring into the fire, that told Ethan she was thinking deeply about something. He didn't interrupt her. He knew she would speak when she was ready. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes serious. "I used to dream about freedom," she said. I'd imagine a life where I didn't have to fight every day just to survive. But I never thought it would feel like this. She paused. I never thought it would feel so empty. Ethan frowned. Empty. Zara nodded. I was so focused on escaping, on being free, that I never considered what it would be like once I actually was. I thought the chains were the only thing holding me back, but now I see that it was never just the chains. It was the fear of what would happen once I was free. Ethan sat down beside her, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the quiet night. I get it, he said softly. Freedom isn't just about breaking free from physical chains. It's about learning to live without fear. It's about trusting yourself, trusting the world around you again. It's about finding purpose. Zira glanced at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. She smiled faintly. And what about you, Ethan? What's your purpose? Ethan took a deep breath. To make sure this. He gestured to the world around them. Doesn't happen to anyone else. To fight for people who don't have a voice. To make sure no one else has to be a slave. Zira's eyes softened. Then we'll do it together. And for the first time since the war began, Ethan believed her. They would do it together. There would be no more running, no more hiding. They would fight. They would survive. They would rebuild. The battle was far from over, but it no longer felt impossible. Together, they could take on anything. As the fire crackled in the night, they sat side by side, no longer just two survivors of a broken world, but two people who had found something even more powerful, hope. And for the first time, both Ethan and Sarah felt like they were truly free.